did offer to do a little song for us earlier. Yeah. We're going to be doing some group work. And I don't do posters, but we can make a mobile instead. Is that all right, David? Does this work? No. Okay, so I think we'll get going. I think it's about time, isn't it? Let me just check. Yeah. So I'm Debra Kidd, and I'm still struggling after 21 years to figure out how it is that children learn how to read. So I'm not going to be giving you any answers here. What I'm hoping to open up is an exploration of the complexity of the matter of getting children to read, and to perhaps cast a little bit of light onto some of the issues that perhaps we as teachers can be thinking about when we're trying to get children to be that elusive quality of a literate human being. And I think we need to just kind of unpick a little bit some of the dialogue around the notion of literacy. The idea that there is research to suggest that 20% of children leave school in the UK functionally illiterate needs unpicking a little bit more, because that doesn't mean to say they can't read or write. They can, on the whole, read and write, but there are certain tasks that they need to be able to do in order to function effectively in life that they struggle with. And it's that kind of functional capacity to be literate and to be numerate that that figure particularly focuses in on. And then when we consider that a little bit more closely and we drill into those figures a little bit more, we find that predominantly those people are boys, and that predominantly those people are boys from chaotic working class backgrounds who've not had the best start in life. So we can start to unpick then a picture not only of how do we get children to read, but how do we get the most difficult, troublesome, people who are really struggling with that idea to read. And I'm hoping that over the course of the next sort of 50 minutes, we'll be able to cast a little bit of light on that. But I kind of wanted to come to it from the idea of complexity theory. And this was something that I suppose I stumbled into as I started my doctorate. I went in to do my doctorate a bit like a lot of teachers going to do in research. I went through my master's, and my master's was quite a reassuring process. It allowed me to prove what I already knew to be true. So basically I went through lots of tasks where I found research that accorded with my worldview and put it into my literature review, and then found data in my classroom that accorded with my worldview and published it and passed my master's. And when I got to doctorate level, I kind of went into that thinking, okay, this is going to take 7 years of me basically treading water until I can get to a point where I can write up a doctorate that proves what I already know to be true. But over the course of that 7 years, what actually happened was that everything I thought I knew was kind of dismantled, and I was left with what looked like pieces of a broken bike on the floor, and I was thinking I'm never going to be able to ride it again. And it was about kind of constructing and putting that together. And I suppose, really, although it was the first time I'd heard it this morning, being in that threshold space, that liminal space, where everything looks like it's going belly up, but actually something new and something exciting is reforming. And for me, complexity theory was one of those ways through. And I think we need to kind of think about complexity, because often what happens and what I hear is people saying to me, well, I don't want complex, I don't want complicated, I just want to know what works. And people want those simple answers. And of course, when we're stressed and we're busy, of course, that's what we want to reach for. But complex doesn't necessarily mean complicated, but it does mean being kind of open, looking at the edges, trying to make connections, trying to see how one intervention might negatively impact on another. And it's just about being aware of the fact that things that we intend might not always have the outcomes that we were hoping for, that there are other factors at play. And how can we manage that complexity? And I'm just going to show you a little clip, because he explains it better than I do. And let's see what you think of this.
So for me, a well-crafted baguette fresh out of the oven is complex. But a curry, onion, green olive, poppy cheese bread is complicated. I'm an ecologist and I study complexity. I love complexity. And I study that in the natural world, the interconnectedness of species. So here's a food web or a map of feeding links between species that live in alpine lakes in the mountains of California. And this is what happens to that food web when it's stocked with non-native fish that never lived there before. All the grayed out species disappear, some are actually on the brink of extinction. And lakes with fish have more mosquitoes, even though they eat them. These effects are all unanticipated, and yet we're discovering they're predictable. So I want to share with you a couple key insights about complexity we're learning from studying nature that maybe are applicable to other problems. First is this simple power of good visualization tools to help untangle complexity and just encourage you to ask questions you didn't think of before. For example, you could plot the flow of carbon through a corporate supply chain in a local ecosystem, or the interconnections of habitat patches for endangered species in Yosemite National Park. The next thing is that if you want to predict the effect of one species on another, if you focus on only that link and then you black box the rest, it's actually less predictable than if you step back, consider the entire system, all the species, all the links, and from that place, hone in on the sphere of influence that matters most. And we're discovering with our research that's often very local to the nodes you care about, within 1 or 2 degrees. So the more you step back and embrace complexity, the better chance you have of finding simple answers, and it's often different than the simple answer that you started with. So let's switch gears and look at a really complex problem, courtesy of the U.S. government. This is a diagram of the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. It was front page of the New York Times a couple months ago, instantly ridiculed by the media for being so crazy complicated. And the stated goal was to increase popular support for the Afghan government. Clearly a complex problem, but is it complicated? Well, when I saw this in the front page of the Times, I thought, great, finally something I can relate to. You know, I can sink my teeth into this. So let's do it. So here you go, for the first time ever, a world premiere view of this spaghetti diagram as an ordered network. The circle node is the one we're trying to influence, popular support for the government. And so now we can look 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees away from that node and eliminate like 3/4 of the diagram outside that sphere of influence. Within that sphere, most of those nodes are not actionable, like the harshness of the terrain, and a very small minority are actual military actions. Most are nonviolent, and they fall into 2 broad categories: active engagement with ethnic rivalries and religious beliefs, and fair, transparent economic development and provisioning of services. I don't know about this, but this is what I can decipher from this diagram in 24 seconds. When you see a diagram like this, I don't want you to be afraid, I want you to be excited, I want you to be relieved, because simple answers may emerge. We're discovering in nature that simplicity often lies on the other side of complexity. So for any problem, the more you can zoom out and embrace complexity, the better chance you have of zooming in on the simple details that matter most. Thank you.
Okay. So that might not mean anything to you, or it may mean something to you. But for me, what I got out of it was this sense, oh, what have I done now? We've got some love music. Just close all tabs. What I found was that I didn't need to be afraid of the idea of complexity. What I had to work out was what was in my sphere of influence. But similarly, we should really beware on focusing too tightly and too closely on a single solution to anything. And I think there have been certain single solutions presented to us as a teaching profession, particularly about reading, but in all areas of subject knowledge in some ways, that try and overemphasize or oversimplify a single solution at the expense of others. So what we're going to try and do over the course of the next sort of half hour really is for us to find out from a whole host of research that I've put onto shiny materials so that it engages you. I was going to do a poster, but you know, we've moved on to CDs now. That if we can kind of try and categorize some of those elements of complexity that surround reading, and there are many more that I could have put in here, but I've just chosen a few, and then think about what is it as classroom teachers we could do to try and find some solutions that would incorporate the different realms. And the realms I've chosen are the emotional. So the red hula hoop here is going to be the emotional realm of reading. The blue is the intellectual cognitive realm of reading, and the green is more the socio-cultural realm of reading. And what we're going to try and do as we go through the course of the session is to try and map those out and then think about in small groups, really, what can we do to ensure that we don't lose one area, but that we keep all 3 in focus, but that we get a balanced view of what it is to be a reader in our schools, and particularly a reader who's struggling. And what we need to do, I suppose, is to try and find ways of like remaining connected. And this idea of emergence in complexity theory is the idea that out of many factors, something, a solution or an event or an outcome emerges that is more than the sum of its parts, that is greater than you would have predicted for each one of those individual elements of the process. And so I guess what we're trying to do is get that kid to pop up as a reader from that multitude of complexity that we have in the classroom. So we're looking really to try and find things that are congruent. So, you know, how can we make the outcomes we want in this intellectual cognitive mode resonate with the emotional and the social? How can we bring those together? How can we connect them? How can we be constructive so that this becomes a safe process for children and also for us as accountable adults who have to prove our outcomes at the end of it? And how do we remain open to the fact that we might be wrong sometimes, that we might make mistakes? How can we embrace failure? How can we ourselves occupy that liminal space that Ray was talking about earlier today and remain open to the possibility of complexity? And I like this quote because I think Davis and Samara, they've written a brilliant book about complexity in education, and if you are interested in it, I definitely recommend you read it. But the idea of the complexity being an umbrella notion that is about rising among, not rising over. It's not about privileging one idea over another. It's not about saying this is right or this is wrong. It's about saying where are the connections, where are the points at which we can find some agreement, where are the points at which there might be some resonance here. And I suppose remaining open-minded to that. So we're going to create a complexity nest. Again, this comes from Davis and Samara, where they talk about this idea of spheres that are interdependent on each other and warn us against the danger of focusing too closely on one particular area. And I'm going to start off with one piece of research that comes from the Clackmannanshire study. And I don't know how many of you have heard of the Clackmannanshire study. You just raise your hands if you have. Primary school teachers tend to all shoot their hands up at this point. The Clackmannanshire study was the study that really kicked off the debate about synthetic phonics and the importance of synthetic phonics in getting children to learn to read. And by read, we really mean decode words. So that first fundamental step as a reader that we have to be able to do, where we take these almost indecipherable symbols on a page and figure out how they make words. And the Clackmannanshire study really specifically looked at what kind of phonics program was most effective for children. It didn't ask the question whether or not phonics itself was worth doing. Everybody assumed that it was, that it has always been an important part of teaching children to read. But this was about emphasis and about structure. And what they found, Johnson and Watson, was that overall we conclude that the synthetic phonics approach as part of a reading curriculum is more effective than the analytical phonics approach as part of a wider reading curriculum. And what happened with this report was that the headline that came out of it was synthetic phonics is the silver bullet to getting children to read. And this is what happens with research all the time. Now I'm going to put that piece of research in the cognitive intellectual domain. And I think what's happened over time is that this has happened. Oh, my torch is suddenly not working, but let's imagine that my torch that was working an hour ago was. We've shone a spotlight on this single issue, whereas in fact, there are all these to consider as well. And what happens is we don't get rid of that, because if we got rid of that, we'd just throw the balance off. Does that make sense? This is an interesting and valid piece of research that we should take seriously, but we should also consider that there are other factors at play. So what I'm going to ask you to do in sort of groups of, I suppose, 4-ish would work, is to take another piece of research and just discuss it for a moment. You're going to, I suppose, if you kind of 4, if you turn around and work together, would that work? You kind of 4. There are some people behind you, David, so perhaps if you guys could work together, and then you 4. Would that work? Here's another one. So if you could turn around and discuss with your partners, little group here. I'm going to give you 2, so I'm going to ask you to work in pairs. All right. And I've got another. David, can I split your group into a 3 and a 2 and give you another little bit? Is that all right? I'm just going to ask you to also consider that one. Is that all right? Because you're the gifted and talented extension group. Is that okay? Yeah. Oh, look, it's working now. everybody has their piece of research, continue discussing it. First of all, just think about where does it sit? Is it intellectual cognitive? Is it emotional? Is it about socio-cultural? And you're going to introduce this piece of research into that domain, but at the same time, as people read out theirs, I want you to think of, are there any connections between my piece of research and theirs? And at one point, we're going to try and move together so that you sit with people who have similar pieces of research. Does that make sense? But for now, just discuss what you think the implications are.
Sorry, I know you're mic'd up. I already have a
That's all right.
question. We weren't quite sure what we meant by movement for reading.
It was any kind of movement, actually. So some of the research was getting children, like, literally to be walking and moving. Others was about adding gestures to reading to try and underline, underscore the memory of keywords.
Right,
Does that
okay.
make sense?
Yeah,
But there seemed to be some correlation between the body and the capacity to read. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask each group to just come forward. I hope it's not too threatening. You don't have to do it through the mode of interpretive dance. If you want to, you can do. If you want to sing it, you can do. But all I'm going to ask is for each group to come forward, read out their piece of research really clearly so everyone can hear. And as you're listening to people coming forward, I want you to think, does that cast any light or connect to my piece? Does that make sense? And keep an eye out for them, because then I'll ask you to find people that you think had resonance with your research as well. So if we start here, do you mind? Is that all right?
First thing we had was between the ages of 10 and 16, children who read for pleasure more than once a week gain higher results in tests, even in maths, than those who do not.
Okay, so children who read for pleasure once a week between the ages of 11 and 16 gain higher results in every subject, even including maths, than those who don't read for pleasure. Would you put that in social, intellectual, emotional?
Well, I think there's a case for putting it in all three.
I think you're probably right, yeah. Shall we make it a little Venn diagram then? Yeah, so we can cross over. Oh. Right, we're getting really complicated now. I think this might be maths, isn't it? So reading for pleasure has a great deal of impact on whether or not children achieve at school. And you know, if you listen to David talk about literacy, he'll remind you of all kinds of things, like the importance of vocabulary, the fact that we access more vocabulary if we read than if we speak, and how that access to level or tier 2 vocabulary in particular is enhanced by access to reading. So children who are reading books are accessing more vocabulary, they're accessing more cultural and social knowledge and the kind of contextual knowledge that they need to make sense of other subjects as well. So it does kind of make sense when you think it through. All right, let's see the next piece.
So the next one we had was, however, although the boys read better than the girls, so it sounded like the second part.
Yeah.
Although the boys read better than the girls, they nevertheless reported a less favourable attitude to reading.
Okay, now that comes from the same study, the Clackmannanshire study. So the authors who found that synthetic phonics led to an improvement, particularly in the boys' ability to decode text, found that those boys at the same time had a less favourable attitude to reading when they were 11. So just have a think for a moment about a boy who can read, who doesn't want to read, leaving primary school at the age of 11, and that research about reading for pleasure. Does that make sense? So we have to connect those things. So where would you put that?
So we felt that it was, there's an emotional response to the reading, but it's also perhaps social as well.
So you might put it in the emotional social sphere. You know, and
I've lost track of colours.
yeah, so we're about here, there, I think, in between the two. Okay, so the desire to read seems to be as significant and important as the capacity. Does that make sense? Let's see if we can cast any more light on this issue. So who's the next group?
We've got one that says children who are read to regularly by parents at the age of 5 perform better in tests age 16 than those who are not.
Okay, so it's not just about reading for pleasure, or maybe it is. So what connection would you draw? The children who were read to regularly by parents at the age of 5 are more likely to achieve well at the age of 16. And can we find any connections between that and reading for pleasure at the age of 11? Don't know, just discuss it with somebody sitting near to you. And where do you think you'd put that?
Social and emotional.
Yeah.
So is that the same?
Yeah, it's the red-green. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, would that not also go into the economic sphere? Because, I mean, by and large, research seems to indicate, not that I've read it all, but the little bit that I've read seems to indicate that it is generally parents with the higher kind of qualifications and therefore the higher earning that tend to read to their children,
Yeah.
and also that better test results then go on to the child earning more. So
Yeah,
would that maybe
yeah,
not go into
yeah,
that middle
absolutely. It would, and there you've got access to books, you've got the ability, time, people not doing shift work, all those kinds of things. Yeah,
even though I'm a single parent,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Does anybody want to come back on that then? You know, about those connections. Are these the same children, for example? We can't say for sure, can we? But is it likely that the same child who's being read to by a parent at the age of 5 is the child who loves reading when they're 11? It wouldn't be a poor correlation to make in that sense. And there's something there, as we were just talking about access to books, access to text, the value that's placed on text in the home place, all that kind of thing. Which is why, the last government invested an awful lot of money in trying to get parents reading with their children. And the two things are not disconnected, but are they within our sphere of influence? This is something we need to keep in the forefront of our minds as teachers. To what extent can we really impact on parents' behaviour at home? And as we go through this process, we'll start to try and hone in on what we can influence. And you may feel that we can influence that situation, but we'd have to think how. Okay. So let's have a look at the next group.
Although most pupils in England are competent readers by secondary age, their interest and commitment to reading is declining substantially.
And what the source of that is?
PISA,
The OECD report. Where would you put that here?
So we were saying that we felt there was an internal struggle, an emotional reaction that affected interest and commitment, but we also thought it was like a socio-cultural external impact.
Okay.
So we put it here.
All right. So a lot of this that's coming out is about not so much about the capacity to read, but about the desire to read. And I'd argue that that's our biggest hurdle. I think we're all pretty good at teaching kids to read, and certainly with access to good books and good blogs and good support, we can all get there. But we have a big social emotional issue that we need to kind of confront as well. Who was next? David, have you got?
Cohen and Stemmer, 2007, said that males produce more cortisol when stressed than females. And so we weren't exactly sure what cortisol was, so we looked it up.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out cortisol is a steroid hormone which is released in response to stress. And what it does, it suppresses the immune system and the metabolization of fat. So what we're saying there is that men are, when stressed, more likely to put on weight and get ill.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. So yes, and we're going to. There's a few more cortisol facts around the room that will add to that. But cortisol seems to have a specifically negative effect on men. And just read your fact out again, because I know other people will be going, oh, we've got cortisol.
Produce more cortisol when stressed than females.
Yeah. So males produce more cortisol when stressed than females. It's partly because females tend to produce something called oxytocin, which has a slightly depressing effect on the cortisol. So what tends to happen is that boys who are exposed to high levels of cortisol over a long period of time are more likely to get ill, they're more likely to miss school, they suffer a lack of empathy, a reduced level of empathy. They want to be alone much more, and it has lots of impacts on cognitive functions, as we'll hear as we go around that. Now, we wouldn't automatically say, would we, just from your fact, that that was going to impact on reading.
No, I was thinking it probably goes round the outside.
It might do. You can put it wherever you like, but it's near the emotional, but it might not actually be within the reading sphere. So we'll kind of have it around there.
What are we linking that to stress to? Just depression reading or life?
No, this is these levels of cortisol are associated with prolonged stress, usually outside of school. So when children are living highly chaotic and stressful environments, short bursts of cortisol are actually good for the brain. And this is where we'd have to start talking about Ray's discussion this morning. Because if you put children who, generally speaking, have happy, healthy lives into a stressful environment in the classroom, where there's a level of challenge, they're in that liminal space, you know, they can see the view out of the window, but they haven't quite got there yet. Those children can generally cope with that extra injection of stress because the rest of their lives are not generally stressful. Children who are already at overload level may not be able to cope with that level of stress in the classroom. We'd have to consider as practitioners, because what you don't want to go is say, well, we're not going to give challenging experiences to those children because they're poor and they come from stressful, chaotic backgrounds. So we'll give them nice, safe, risk-free experiences where there's not a level of challenge. We don't want to say that, but what we do have to ask the question of is how do we make that liminal space, that stressful learning space, feel somehow secure? And that's a big challenge, I think. Let's see the group at the back.
Underwood in 2009 said, as a result of the combination of adding movement to reading test scores showed improvement.
Okay.
And what we said this probably cognitive, is about adding meaning to words.
Mm-hmm.
So we took movement there to be gesticulation, often or possibly linked to maybe reading out loud, confidence, that kind of stuff. So we thought that would probably be a cognitive development.
Yeah, okay.
Almost on its own, I suppose.
Yeah, that's fine. Come and pop it in there. There's an awful lot of really interesting research coming out at the moment about embodied cognition and the way that the body helps us to remember and to interpret concepts. So if you are interested in that research, Underwood's a good place to look, but also Susan Goldin Meadow wrote a brilliant book about how our hands help us to learn. She's specifically looking at maths teaching, but how children and teachers gesture conceptual understanding before they speak it, and that there's something that emerges from the body before the brain actually articulates. And certainly with reading, that seems to be the case, this burgeoning understanding. All right, next group.
Okay, we had Robert Sapolsky, I hope this got right, in 2000, said cortisol, the hormone released when stressed, damages the hippocampus, central to learning and memory.
Okay, so cortisol has a damaging effect on the hippocampus, and if you know anything about brain, the learning brain, the hippocampus is the centre of memory. So cortisol has a negative impact on memory. Now, if we combine that with David's piece of research, it affects men worse than it does affect women. It affects boys worse than it affects women. So the retention of memory is worse for boys who are living under highly stressful environments. Okay, next piece of research.
We had secure student-teacher relationships predict greater knowledge, higher test scores, greater academic motivation, and fewer special education referrals. And we talked about how that, predominantly in the emotional section, about how the relationship, because social as well, but if you're happy with the relationship with your teacher,
Okay.
those things lead to.
Okay, and Hattie and Yates talk about this quite a lot, about how central to learning the relationship between teacher and student is. I'd say, are you putting that in the emotional? Sorry, it's this bit here. No, it's all right. I was thinking like red, anger, love, all that kind of thing. I should have labelled them, of course. No, it's my fault. This centrality, the importance of relationships in the classroom, it can't be overlooked. And I think too often in our search for the simple, what we tend to do is go, if you do X, Y, and Z in the classroom, your children will learn, and we ignore the importance of that central relationship. And I think particularly for children who are living in stressful environments, if you talk to them, they say that they just want people to ask how they are. They want people to know them. They want people to acknowledge the fact that life isn't easy for them. Don't want a big fanfare about it. But I was listening to, a man who's 21 now, Chris Lydell, he's Scottish, the other day speaking about how he dropped out of school in year 9. He'd spent his whole life growing up with his mum, who was a heroin addict, moving from rehabilitation centre to council house to rehabilitation centre. Sometimes he was being sent in a taxi 20 miles to school. The best thing about school, he said, at primary level was that he got a meal every day and he felt safe. But when he went to secondary school, that relationship that he had with teachers started to fall apart a little bit, and he started to play up, as a lot of children do. And he said what children living in those really stressful environments tend to do is to hide in plain sight. And he said they hide in plain sight by being the one who is seen, the class clown, the disruptor, but what they're hiding is the circumstance of their lives. And he talks about how he walked into, in Scotland it's social studies, it'd be kind of an integrated humanities course here, one day, and the teacher was holding a DVD, and the DVD was of him and his family for a documentary about poor children. It had been animated so that you couldn't recognise his face, but it was his story, and the DVD was called Chris's Story, The Wrong Trainers, a case study of poverty in our society. And the social studies teacher was about to show it to the whole class. In fact, all of the social studies classes in his year group were about to be shown this DVD. And he went to his teacher and he said, please do not show that DVD, it's about me. And the teacher shrugged him off and said, of course it's not about you, stop joking, sit down. And he said it was the worst 45 minutes of his life, and he did not go back to school. And he just missed all his exams, and he's an articulate, brilliant young man when you listen to him speak. But he said it was easier for his teacher to believe that he was joking than to face the reality of the fact that this could possibly be his life. And I think we need to consider, those invisible children when we're teaching. Now, this might not immediately seem to have anything to do specifically with reading, but if their cognitive function is impaired by stress, if they're trying to hide that fact from us, then those stubborn, difficult children who we just seem to not be able to get through to often are suffering from this. And the other thing is, you can go into school and absolutely, you can say phonics is the answer. 1 in 6 children in this country are undiagnosed with glue ear when they're young children. There used to be free hearing tests for all children in primary school. That doesn't happen anymore. So they remain undiagnosed. So at the critical point of development in primary school, when they're being taught phonics, where they really need to be able to hear the difference between air and or, they can't. They can hear the hard consonant sounds and they can hear generally the patterns of words, but the distinctiveness of some of those spelling patterns they can't hear. Now, glue ear tends to clear up over time. So by the time they come to secondary school, age 11, they might well be able to hear those differences, and at that point you need to intervene and teach them phonics. Now, there's no way you'll know because it was undiagnosed. You might say to a child, did you have difficulty hearing when you were younger? Do you remember finding that difficult? They might say yes. So in certain circumstances, a good dose of phonics is exactly what they need, but it's not necessarily the only solution that might work. Let's see what else we might have here. So which group's next?
High quality classroom talk raises standards in the core subjects as typically measured in national and international tests. That's Resnick and Michael's.
Okay, so high quality classroom talk. We'll unpick that a little bit more in a moment about what they mean by high quality classroom talk. What would we do there then in terms of?
Well, in our discussion, we sort of wanted to put it in all three, basically, because it kind of was social, but also obviously language and emotion, and the discussion, etc. So, and also obviously intellectual. So,
Yeah.
we want to put it in the middle.
Yeah. And yeah, you can put it wherever you like. I don't mind at all. There's no right or wrong answer to this. And a lot of these things are complex. Michael's and Resnick's research into accountable talk's really interesting because they don't just say get children talking. They say these are the conditions under which talk really generates better thinking, better writing, better reading skills. And they place great emphasis on the accountability to knowledge, the accountability to facts, the accountability to extended vocabulary, making children push their language to another level. the accountability to each other, so they should be held accountable. Their talk should be publishable, it should be shared, it should be challenged, it should be investigated. And the accountability to logic and reasoning, and the fact that they should be able to follow through sequences and reach conclusions and draw conclusions. And under those circumstances, classroom talk seems to produce excellent writing outcomes, but also encourages children to read, because in order to be able to be accountable to knowledge, to be accountable to the facts, to be accountable to vocabulary, they have to go away and find things out. So it's interesting to look at their research, because it brings together that speaking and listening, reading and writing into a realm that is quite structured.
We've got Newcomer 2009. Children suffering from persistent stress suffer verbal decorative memory loss due to the impact of cortisol. They have an impaired ability to recall words and information.
Okay, so children who are subjected to prolonged periods of stress in which cortisol is present, and pull together the idea that males have this more than females under those situations, suffer verbal declarative memory loss. That's your memory loss for words, effectively. Memory loss for words and for retaining information. Where would you pop that, Alan?
Well, we were going to put it in the middle.
Yeah, okay. And I think finally,
We've got the Boys Reading Commission 2013. The gap in reading test scores between genders aged 7 is 7%. By the age of 16, this has doubled to 14%.
okay. So at the age of 11, when children are leaving primary school, did you say
Age of
7? Age of 7, the difference in reading skill between boys and girls is 7%, is that right?
Yeah.
By the time they leave school, it's 14%, it's doubled. Okay, now, do you think that is possibly connected to the impact of stress on boys, or to their desire to read? Does that make sense? Because what we're learning is, at the age of 11, boys are losing the desire to read. Even if we take away the ones who are living in chaotic, stressful environments, just the ones who have a great life, they're losing the desire to read. Now, I have 3 boys who are all avid readers, and we'll all have kids who we go, no, boys love reading. But that's because we love reading. We have a house full of books. We sat them on our knees when they were babies. We read to them, and, all those kind of social conditions. But generally speaking, as a pattern, boys are not enjoying reading. So pop that where you think it should go. All right. So if we were, we're not Americans trying to figure out what to do in Afghanistan, but we are teachers in our classrooms trying to figure out the best steps we could take to support children in their reading. And I could have put loads more stuff in there. I could have referred to cultural literacy. I could have referred to the Hirsch stuff. There's a lot of stuff there about vocabulary and about knowledge and all kinds of things that should also be in that session. But I kind of wanted us to think a little bit about what's within our sphere of influence. What can we do about this? So I'm just going to ask you in your groups again, so you can think about your own research, and if you want to, you can bandy together with people who had similar pieces of research to come up with a strategy that you think you might be able to implement in your school to deal with that particular issue. So just take a minute or a couple of minutes to think about that. What would be focused on that particular issue? I think it might be useful if you two went and worked with David and, yeah, all right.
The oxytocin levels increases completely.
say, I wish we had like a whole day on this, because I reckon that all together we could solve the problem of getting kids to read if we put our heads together. I think sometimes, and obviously I'll take everybody's contributions, but I think sometimes we do overcomplicate things a little bit. And I love this quote from Richard Feynman. He was the one, I hated physics at school. Basically, I went to school and our physics teacher used to be on a Wednesday morning, and our physics teacher used to like go and have a cigarette and a cup of coffee on the fire escape, and he'd have a pile of textbooks on his desk, and he'd just write on the blackboard, you can tell how old I am, on the blackboard there would be a page number on it, and that was basically our physics lesson, and he'd have a little smoke and a drink while we just actually talked about the football from the night before. So apart from like the velocity and angle of hitting a football, I didn't really learn much about physics. And then I came across Richard Feynman when I was a bit older, and I was interested in this stuff and learned a great deal from him. But I love this quote: physics is like sex. Sure, it may give some practical results, but that's not why we do it. I think sometimes we apply that thinking to reading, that it's about getting them to just get the words off the page. And in that, we lose some of the magic. And I wonder if there's a way of injecting that magic back into it so that we're not losing these boys at age 11. So let's just go round, really, the groups, and just kind of a solution or an idea or a possible solution that we can think of that may only be embryonic at this moment in time. We're trying to connect these things together. We're trying to think of how we see and interpret children at an individual level and their needs. We need to understand the research and connect that together. Basically, what researchers do is they, if I go back to my torch analogy again, they go, I'm interested in reading, but I'm going to look at this very, very specific angle because that's what a researcher has to do. But as a teacher, what we need to do is gather it all and make sense of it for ourselves. Does that make sense? We've got to look at the whole picture. We can't be focusing in on one tiny little thing at the expense of other things. So what did we kind of just generally think over here?
So stuff that we're thinking of implementing. So we're trying to organise something that Leanne thinks she stole from one of David's blogs. Is reading as a rebel act. We're going to have a banned books list in school, and when we're going to circulate several copies to different students that we think really could benefit from having that interest in reading. And then they're sort of going to be invited to a special club that we know is not going to be advertised to the whole school. We're going to pick certain students again to come to that, and we're going to look at a list of banned books from around the world and why they were banned, and think about reading those as well.
Yeah,
it's very early at the moment. We're just trying to.
It's a sticking plaster program thing as well, and we're looking at really how we make it. I think the lady behind me said something about a community.
Yeah.
Reading, and that's what we're trying to move towards.
Yeah.
But
it's really difficult, isn't it, as teachers, because reading for pleasure almost makes any attempts to get children reading an antipathy or an opposite. So you, in a way, want to entice and make it seem something. I think the rebel idea is quite nice. Maybe leaving books in secret locations with clues and treasure hunts and things like that. And then the children have to maybe leave that in another location and they come up with the clues. I don't know. Maybe something like that. So like just this idea of a secret. I love that idea. Anything else? This group here.
I read to my classes because they're so the ways I teach are so reluctant to read. The 20-minute silent read that our school does is torture for them, and because I want them to engage in the story, find that appealing, they want to know what happens next, what other books has that author written, and hopefully, fingers crossed, they'll ultimately want to pick up the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you're saying is I'm going to focus here on reading for pleasure. Yeah. And if that means me reading it and them engaging with the story, then that, yeah.
Just in English, we've got people reading history, for instance, a book please. So the history teacher in our school bought everybody a copy of the book please. And we have a reading time of 10 minutes at the end of the day. She's been reading it to them, but what the kids have insisted on is longer. They really like that reading time.
Yeah. Kids love to be read to. Adults love to be read to.
Yeah, even the older kids.
Yeah, they do.
My set 1 year 11s who are really exceptionally sophisticated in their
Yeah.
It's like a little primary school, so sort of, you know, put the beanbags out job when you read to them.
But the
Yeah.
reason is the stress of decoding is removed. So they can enjoy and they can picture and create visual imagery. So one of the things I find quite difficult is that when they read on their own, they try to do too many things at once. If they're not proficient readers, and I suppose it's taking that stress away.
Yeah.
But then how do you bridge to the next part?
And we still want them to become proficient readers. But I think what we're saying is that there are two roles we have as teachers here. We have the role of teaching reading, which is vital, and we wouldn't throw that out. But we also have the role as modelling the fact that reading is a beautiful, enriching, you know, life-enhancing thing to do. And those two things are not necessarily the same. And I think keeping that in mind is really important. I don't think we're going to have time to kind of sweep around everyone. So I'm just going to ask if you had an idea or you want to contribute something, if you just speak out now. We won't take it in any particular order.
Well, we tied a couple of things together because we had one of the cortisol ones to begin with. So we think about boys and what we can do to try and reduce their stress, I suppose. And it was tying into, I think it was the group behind us at the time, who were talking about how actions and gestures can reduce cortisol levels, I think. So we were just talking about the idea of competition and introducing that to reading in some way. There's plenty of schemes out there already, but I suppose you have to think carefully about what the competition was. Introducing an element of that might reduce the stress because boys thrive in competition. So.
Yeah, many boys do, and that's like the role of testosterone, I think, in there as well. The interesting thing there then is what I've seen in some schools, and it happened in the school I was in, that some of the boys that were having difficulty in reading were withdrawn for extra literacy lessons. I think it was the McGraw, I can't remember what it's called that. Is it the McGraw-Graf scheme? I can't remember. But basically, and their lessons they were taken out of were PE. And yet we know that physical activity produces endorphins that reduces stress. So those boys were like doubly bound by that intervention. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't give them extra literacy lessons, but let's think about what, you know, art and PE in particular are very therapeutic activities for children to do. So let's not take them out of those lessons. Let's be thinking, you know, more holistically. Anything else anyone wants to add? Yes.
It's not specifically to do with secondary teaching. I think at primary schools, I think there are far greater numbers by the age of 11 who aren't reading proficiently. And teacher training colleges, not all of them, but most of them do not show student teachers about the alphabetic principle of how best to teach. If you teach it efficiently, you can get through it very early on, and by year 6, there are schools in deprived areas by year 6 who are reading Shakespeare, Chaucer, loads and loads. You know, with a real reading enthusiasm.
Yeah.
But they've got their children reading.
Yeah, they have. I mean, I think actually that has shifted dramatically. I know that when I worked in teacher training at MMU, from about 2007 onwards, nearly everything had to have phonics infused in it. And in fact, what actually got lost was the unit I taught on children's literature that, you know, a lot of my students used to really love, because it said if a child likes this book, they'll also like these other 20 books. So they had this like massive canon of text. That got dropped in favour of more synthetic phonics. And in the end, it felt like that was all we were teaching. But it is really important. And again, it's that beam thing, isn't it? Let's not lose the balance across the system. Yeah. I think we're pretty much out of time. Has anyone got a watch on them? And it is lunchtime, and that's the worst thing you can possibly do, run into lunch. But I hope you found it at least thought-provoking and something to go away and think about. So thank you for your time, and thank you for taking part.